There's a genre of horror games that uses more than just jump scares or scary monsters to invoke terror. It makes the player feel helpless and vulnerable by de-emphasizing the combat and taking control away from the player to make you feel like you're actually struggling to survive against the game. Once upon a time, this was done with certain design techniques such as limited ammo supplies, fixed camera angles, tank controls, and terrifying atmospheres. This was the classic age of survival horror games, and though survival horror lives on to this day, there was something undeniably unique and different about this short-lived era of gaming from the late 90s to the early 2000s. Today I'm going to break down the origins of survival horror games, what made them so unique and good, and I'll explain why the old school style games with fixed camera angles, tank controls, and a big emphasis on puzzles ended up disappearing from the gaming landscape. Back in the 80s and 90s, there were the precursors to modern survival horror games. Games like Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark would pave the way for the game that actually coined the term survival horror in 1996, Resident Evil, published by Capcom. Resident Evil actually began as kind of a remake of sorts of Sweet Home, but ended up growing into something much more substantial. Resident Evil, of course, was wildly successful, even though Capcom didn't really expect it to be, and thus, the survival horror genre was properly born and would explode in popularity over the next 8 or so years. Resident Evil established what would be common elements of the genre, such as a large emphasis on puzzles, limited ammo supplies, and the idea that sometimes you just end up having to run away from the enemy instead of fighting them. These are some of the core ideas of survival horror, and Resident Evil would use them to continue to pave the way for survival horror with the release of Resident Evil 2 in 1998 and Resident Evil 3 in 1999. During this time, other survival horror games like Clock Tower also started to pop up, and the genre really was in full swing at this point. But it was then, in 1999, that a new survival horror franchise enters the scene, this one focusing on intense psychological horror and a spooky town blanketed with fog. Enter Silent Hill, published by Konami. Silent Hill was different in a lot of ways from Resident Evil. It used a fully 3D environment, unlike Resident Evil's pre-rendered backgrounds. It also, like I said earlier, placed a focus on psychological horror instead of pure visceral horror like Resident Evil. That right there is a big part of what made Silent Hill stand out from the crowd, and it's what caused Silent Hill to become one of the most influential survival horror franchises, and one of the important ones I'm going to continue to talk about in this video. With the release of Silent Hill, survival horror had entered a golden age of sorts. It was at this point in the genre where it was arguably at its peak. Resident Evil had been kind of coasting along a little bit with games like Code Veronica. Not that it was bad, but you know, they were just in the groove. But it was in 2002 when classic-style Resident Evil hit its peak with the release of Resident Evil Remake. Remake took everything that was great about these old-school games and cranked it up to 11. Pre-rendered backgrounds look beautiful to this day. The lighting, the shadows are great, the tank controls, while cumbersome and kind of hard to learn, they enhance the difficulty of surviving. Fixed camera angles are used to cleverly frame the whole game and emphasize whatever it is the developer wants the player to focus on, whether consciously or subconsciously. Many people, myself included, consider Resident Evil Remake to be one of the best survival horror games of all time. Other great games came both before and after RE Remake, of course, like Silent Hill 2, which for the large part paved the way for games to be seen more as an art form with its amazing story. Other games, of course, came out during this time, such as Silent Hill 3, Fatal Frame, Parasite Eve, and many, many others that I haven't even mentioned here. It was this time period, from about 1996 to 2004, where survival horror ruled the roost. But of course, this video is about the rise and fall of survival horror. So of course, this all must come crashing down eventually, right? And it did all end. In fact, It ended suddenly, very, very suddenly. Almost overnight, it seemed like the genre changed. Resident Evil 4, released in early 2005, contained a much more action-oriented playstyle than previous Resident Evil games. Around the same time, Silent Hill's original devs, Team Silent, got disbanded, and most survival horror games after this point followed in Resident Evil 4's footsteps by using a more action-oriented playstyle. So what happened to the genre? Why did everything change so suddenly? Well, the games may have suddenly shifted to a more action focus, but the events that led to this shift had actually been going on for several years before the release of Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil as a franchise was seemingly just getting better and better with the release of Resident Evil Remake, and of course Resident Evil 0 as well. Not as many people like that game. I did though. Once again, in my opinion, really solid game. But the thing is, despite the fact that Resident Evil Remake is widely considered as one of the best horror games ever, and despite being praised tremendously by critics even at the time, the game did not sell well compared to previous Resident Evil titles. This was most likely because Capcom had signed an exclusivity deal with Nintendo so that these Resident Evil games would be exclusive to Nintendo's platform, like the GameCube. Now, don't get me wrong, the GameCube was a fine console and had some pretty good games on it, but compared to the legendary status and sale figures of the PS2, the GameCube was nothing in comparison, and sales for both Remake and Resident Evil 0 were definitely hurt a lot by this decision. This, combined with the fact that reviewers often complained about the difficult, antiquated controls in Resident Evil titles, both led, most likely, to Resident Evil 4 being very different from what came before it. Capcom had already known they wanted to do something different with Resident Evil 4, and it's widely known that they threw around several concepts for this game over its pretty long development cycle. One concept eventually morphed into another very popular Capcom series. You may have heard of it. It's called Devil May Cry. A different Resident Evil 4 concept, often referred to as Resident Evil 3.5, saw our protagonist Leon investigating a castle and other settings while suffering from a virus causing hallucinations, resulting in a game that, while still using a third-person camera like the release version of Resident Evil 4, it had a feeling much more similar to traditional RE games, and also felt kind of Silent Hill-ish, honestly. It seemed a little bit more survival-oriented. This idea, however, was largely scrapped due to technical problems, but also, apparently, because it was too similar to the old games. Now, I don't know for sure, but I bet that part of why this version of Resident Evil 4 got scrapped was probably because Remake and Resident Evil 0 sold poorly, and Capcom thought it was time for a change. This, of course, spelled the end for classic tank control style Resident Evil, and led to the games that we have today. Now, as for the other major player in survival horror, Silent Hill, their story is also one of change. Silent Hill is a series that was doing very well overall, but after some people criticized Silent Hill 3 for being too similar to Silent Hill 2, Team Silent started work on something that was quite a bit different. The result was Silent Hill 4, which introduced some unique concepts to the series, such as having one hub area leading between a series of levels that acted as the only save point in the game. Additionally, sequences in this central hub were in the first-person camera instead of being in third-person like the rest of the game. I made a whole video on Silent Hill 4 that I'll link to you guys in the cards, but in summary, Silent Hill 4 was a very weird game, honestly kind of painful to play through, and it wasn't nearly as well received and didn't sell as well as Konami wanted it to. The result was that the next year, Konami broke up Team Silent because they, quote, wanted their games to have a different feel, end quote. Personally, I think that since Silent Hill 4 was basically a fail in Konami's mind, they pretty much just disbanded Team Silent. And for those of you who know much about the Silent Hill series, you know just how well this decision turned out for the games. The answer is, of course, not very well. It ended terribly. So that was basically it for the golden age of survival horror. In summary, Resident Evil got poor sales, so Capcom changed to more action-oriented games, while Silent Hill 4 did bad and led Konami Konami to squander one of their best franchises, whoring it out to developer after developer, slowly dragging it through the mud and ultimately destroying it. Meanwhile, the rest of the survival horror genre started incorporating more and more action elements, following the trend that Resident Evil set, just like they always did. Look, I know I've framed all this very negatively so far, but don't get me wrong. I do enjoy newer survival horror games for what they are. Most of them are pretty unique, quite good, and have a lot of varied concepts to them. But still, the way they are, the way they feel, is undeniably different from the games that came before them. Admittedly, a lot of the changes that came to these series came as a simple factor of evolution. People didn't like tank controls and fixed camera angles, and frankly, I don't blame them for that. It's hard to get into these games, because physically controlling your character is hard to do. And frankly, I don't blame people for disliking that. It totally is antiquated, and I get why the industry went away from this. But it's this self-imposed difficulty that makes these games so intense to me. It's what makes them scarier, and in my opinion, more fun to play through. It's that struggle against the game that makes it so unique. The funny thing, however, I will say, is that at least for Resident Evil, they weren't trying to use tank controls to purposely make the game harder. The game being harder was just kind of a side effect of having tank controls. They didn't do it for that reason. It's just the control scheme they used. I thought that was kind of funny. But either way, these antiquated controls made the game much more tense and harder to master. And once again, I totally get why games went away from combat and control schemes like they had in those old games. But I still love games that use these things, no matter how old they may seem and how antiquated these control schemes are. And I don't think I'm the only one that feels this way. And though the genre has changed its ways, and we're probably never going to see a game like Resident Evil Remake or Silent Hill 2 again, at least not from a big publisher, at least today the genre is still alive, and at least companies like Capcom are still trying to innovate with the genre. I wish I could say the same thing about Konami, but sadly, they're just cashing in on their IPs and using it for gambling. It's really a terrible shame what they've done. But like I said, at least they're not the only ones in the industry. At least there are other survival horror series that are doing pretty well in this day and age. The golden age of survival horror games came and went, and these style of games are probably not going to come back. But at least the genre itself is still around. At least these games are still being made, and at least most of them are pretty good. That's it for today's video. If you liked it, make sure to drop a like and subscribe if you want to see more of my content in the future. That's going to do it for me today. I'm out.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.